Good morning everyone. Today we are talking about SMSF super trusts and things of that nature. So the question was around SMSF, people wanting to buy a potential property inside them. So there's a few key things you need to know about self-managed superannuation funds. Firstly, they're quite expensive. Establishment fee approximately for one of those is about $3,000 with an accountant. But what really costs a lot is in terms of the auditing. They have to get audited every single year. They have to do a BAS just like any other company. They have to do a NDV tax return just like any other company. But, so the first thing to understand is if a client wants self-managed super fund, we have to understand whether it's worth it for them to do so. So calculate around $6,000 a year, being the auditing fees, as a percentage of the total balance. So $6,000 over $100,000 is a 6% cost base. So that means investment need to do more than 6% for them to break even. That's point one. Point two, to understand about self-managed superannuation funds is very important one, and one that's most often misunderstood. It's the arm's length transaction rule. Now, you can buy property inside superannuation, you can buy vintage cars, antiques, and all that jazz inside superannuation as long as it's deemed to have an investment profit component. You can even start a business inside superannuation. You can even do things such as purchase investments from yourselves, depending what they are, depending on the asset class, which I'll tell you about. But where the arm's length transaction rule applies is yourself or immediate family member. You cannot buy something from yourself or an immediate family member, or you can't pay yourself or an immediate family member. So it has to be quite distant. You cannot develop or renovate a property in self-managed super fund. You cannot lend against the property in self-managed superannuation fund. When the loan is there, it's for the asset, no more, no less, and you can't get a top up on that asset, not like a normal fund. So what are the benefits? The first benefit obviously is autonomy of choice, control. You can allocate that money as you see fit as per your investment strategies and classes. So the client needs to identify whether they need to do something different than what their retail super trust offers. So if they want to do it for shares, for share trading, for EFTs, for bonds and all that sort of jazz, for even fixed interest, it makes no logical sense because you can do the same thing in the retail trust with a percentage of the cost base. So that's the first itemized component. So what they are really buying a self-managed superannuation trust for is generally to buy an investment property as an example, or for business purposes. So in the super trust, to buy a property, you need to maintain a 20% component of the super trust, 30% component of the super trust in investments, 10% in cash, and the other 60% can be used for the deposit on an investment property. To get a loan for a self-managed super fund property, you can only get up to a 40% LVR. Sorry, a 60% LVR. That means you have to come up with a 40% deposit for 40% deposit on the premises. The interest rate on a self-managed super fund is higher than a normal one, even though it's got marginal risk associated with it. So normally interest rate for a self-managed super fund is at 5.5% to 6% compared to your 3.8, 4.2%. But again, people still choose to do that firstly because they fundamentally believe in property as an investment class. But secondly as well, obviously, most people don't have that kind of cash laying around in their own personal asset classes. So it's very important to note why they want to use that as a scenario. Now, talking about passing assets through, the only assets you can pass through from your personal self to your self-managed super self, and I make that distinction very openly because there are two different beings. Peter Curry and Peter Curry Super Trust are two different beings. So if Peter Curry is bankrupt, his superannuation trust can still get a loan. It's got nothing to do with Peter Curry. So they're two different entities, two different beings. So if I wanted to pass assets from myself to my super trust, which are things like shares and commercial properties, I'm allowed to do that. But it does trigger a capital gains tax component and a new stamp duty, because there's a new change of title. The only difference in this is it doesn't breach the arm's length transaction ruling. And a scenario where that may be quite beneficial to an individual is, let's say I'm a business owner, I have my office, I've bought my office, I own it. I may choose, and with perfect logical sense, to sell my own occupied commercial premises to my superannuation trust. It has to be at market rates, right? You can't just undersell or oversell. Let's say I decide to sell that to my super trust, then my super trust can then rent that premises to my company, which is again a different entity to myself. In a scenario where the rent may be slightly more exorbitant, then they can use that money in a tax-free scenario, or a minimized tax scenario, to pay off more of that debt. And that would also free up more cash flow for the company or the individual who owns it, right? So that could be a scenario where that's relevant. Or it could be a scenario where the client is going into and transitioning into a retirement phase. They want to hold some of their assets inside superannuation. If they have commercial assets or shares, they can sell them to themselves. I believe shares have an in species component, but please check with Yusuf or Christine on that to confirm with me. In species refers to the fact that there's no capital gains tax. It's actually a direct transition from the individual to the superannuation trust. All right. So, long and short of it, downsides: measure up the cost base. If the cost base is too high for the individual, which means that we have to do too much with the super trust to break even on the auditing fees, then it's not in the best interest of the client. That's part one. But again, the client may still choose to pay that, provided they have the capacity to purchase a property if that's what they feel good about, right? So also look at SG. If the SG is like 9,000 bucks a year and they have 6 grand in fees, but they want to buy a property, let them make the call when you do the calculation. All right. So part one, you have to make sure it's feasible for them to do so. Generally, the sweet spot's around the $200,000 mark, but it can be a bit less depending on how cheap the property is likely to be. Secondly, you can't build. So when you're looking at a property to buy, it has to be established and built. There's ways around that, which obviously if you have a client who's interested in buying a property and you want to get them referred to us, send them to me and I'll take care of that one for them. 3, you can't lend against that property again. So make sure if you're buying it, you're going to buy it with as much debt as possible within the superannuation trust, because if you need that capital again, it's going to be hard to come by because you can't lend against the equity and buy another one. Point 4, the credibility of the asset. Decide whether you can buy it from yourself in terms of the in-species transfer or with a commercial asset. If it's not an arm's length transaction, it can't be done, right? Number one, guys, always come back to basics. The number one reason self-managed super fund is, or any kind of super fund is there, it's all for the tax benefits. So look at whether there's a structuring benefit to have an inside super or outside of superannuation. That's always extremely key. So another few things we discussed. Oh yeah, lastly as well, we're not limited to which insurances we can use if we use a self-managed super fund. We're also not limited to which structures or facilities we can use should we use a self-managed superannuation fund. So just because we have an SMSF doesn't mean we can't use the Asgard platform, the BT platform, whatever that may be. So there's an important note there. Lastly, guys, again, go through the costs with them, make sure it all makes logical sense. I apologize if I did ramble and backtrack a bit too much. I'm just trying to get you guys the right relevant information where possible. If you have any further questions about SMSF, please guys, don't hesitate to let me know, and we'll see what we can do. We'll just get it organized one step at a time, guys. All right, take care.